Have you ever felt this strange tension from someone who says they care about you, supports you, even praises you, yet something feels off? Like their smile fades a little too fast when you succeed, or their energy shifts the moment you stay calm, kind, and unbothered. I want you to stay with me till the end of this video, because what I'm about to share might completely change how you see certain people in your life. You see, not everyone who stands close to you is standing with you. Some people don't envy your money, your looks, or your success. They envy your inner peace, your emotional depth, your ability to feel without becoming bitter. And that's dangerous territory for them. Today, I'm breaking down why empaths unknowingly trigger envy in people who pretend to love them through the lens of Carl Jung's psychology, but in a way that feels real, not textbook. As I speak, notice who comes to your mind. That's not an accident. If at any point you feel understood, seen, or quietly exposed by these words, don't just watch silently. Drop a comment and let me know what resonated with you. And if you want more content that speaks to you like a real conversation, not a lecture, hit subscribe, because this channel isn't about noise, it's about truth. When Carl Jung spoke about the shadow, he wasn't talking about something mysterious or evil. He was talking about the parts of ourselves we learned to hide in order to survive. The emotions we were told were too much, the sensitivity we were shamed for, the fear, the need for love, the anger we never learned how to express safely. Over time, these parts don't disappear, they go underground. Now here's where empaths come in. Empaths don't walk around trying to expose anyone, yet their presence alone has a strange effect. They listen deeply, they respond honestly, they feel without apology, and without realizing it, they reflect emotional truths that others have spent years denying. When an empath shows authenticity, it highlights another person's emotional avoidance. When an empath is vulnerable without collapsing, it confronts someone who learned to armor up. This is not inspiring for everyone, it is uncomfortable, because the shadow does not want to be seen. A person who has buried their softness or emotional depth doesn't experience the empath as kind or healing at first. They experience them as a mirror they didn't ask for. And mirrors don't lie. They silently show us what we've abandoned in ourselves. That's why admiration quietly turns into tension. What looks like support starts to feel forced. Envy begins not because the empath has something external, but because they are living in alignment with parts the other person had to kill off to fit in, to be accepted, to feel safe. Jung believed that whatever we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves, we project onto others. So instead of admitting, "I lost touch with my emotions," the mind says, "You're too sensitive." Instead of facing inner emptiness, it says, "You think you're better than me." The empath becomes the emotional scapegoat for someone else's unresolved inner conflict. And this is where pretend love is born. The person stays close, not out of connection, but out of comparison. They smile, they compliment, they say the right things, yet inside, there is a quiet irritation they can't explain. Being around the empath stirs feelings they worked hard to numb. It brings up grief they never processed, needs they never allowed themselves to have, and fears they buried so deeply they forgot they were there. The empath doesn't trigger envy by doing anything wrong, they trigger it by being whole. By allowing themselves to feel sadness without shame, joy without guilt, compassion without self-betrayal. That level of emotional permission threatens people who built their identity around suppression. Jung called this the terror of self-knowledge, the fear that if we look too closely, the carefully constructed persona will collapse. So instead of turning inward, many people turn hostile in subtle ways. Passive comments, withheld warmth, silent competition. The empath feels this shift but often doubts themselves because on the surface nothing obvious is happening. Yet energetically, the relationship has changed. The shadow has been activated, and shadows don't attack directly, they undermine. Envy in this sense is not about wanting what the empath has, it's about resenting what the empath represents. A life where emotional truth is allowed. A self that didn't have to be amputated to be loved. And the hardest part is this: the person experiencing envy often doesn't consciously know what they're feeling. They just know that being near the empath makes them uneasy. It reminds them of who they could have been if they hadn't shut down. So love becomes mixed with resentment, closeness with comparison, affection with quiet hostility. Jung warned that when the shadow is ignored, it doesn't disappear, it acts out. And often it acts out through relationships, especially with those who embody what we fear to reclaim in ourselves. False affection often looks convincing on the surface. It sounds warm, supportive, even loving. But if you look closely, it depends on something unspoken: control, validation, or the need to be seen as a good person. Carl Jung described this as the persona, the social mask we wear to gain acceptance and protect our ego. Many people don't relate from their true self, they relate from this mask. Their affection is not rooted in emotional truth, but in how the relationship makes them feel about themselves. Now, this is where empaths quietly change the atmosphere. Empaths do not connect through performance. They don't calculate affection or use emotions as currency. They show up with emotional integrity, meaning their feelings, words, and actions are aligned. There is no hidden agenda, and this alignment is deeply destabilizing to someone whose love depends on approval or control. When an empath listens without needing praise, cares without keeping score, and sets boundaries without guilt, the other person feels exposed. Not attacked, exposed. Jung warned that authenticity threatens the persona because it reveals how fragile it really is. A person who pretends to love expects something in return, even if they never say it out loud. They expect loyalty without honesty, closeness without boundaries, admiration without equality. The empath doesn't play this game. They don't need to be liked to feel secure. They don't adjust their emotional truth to maintain harmony. And slowly, this creates tension. The admirer begins to feel irrelevant. Their gestures don't earn dependency. Their approval doesn't carry power. What once felt like connection now feels like rejection, even though nothing cruel has happened. This is how false affection collapses, not through confrontation, but through the absence of need. Jung believed that when the ego cannot control an outcome, for someone invested in image, the empath's emotional independence feels like a loss of influence. The relationship no longer feeds their identity. So warmth cools, compliments become conditional, support becomes inconsistent, resentment creeps in quietly, disguised as distance or criticism. The person may not even understand why they're upset. All they know is that the empath no longer reflects back the validation they crave. And instead of questioning their own motives, they project the discomfort outward. They accuse the empath of being distant, cold, or ungrateful. But what they're really reacting to is the collapse of their emotional leverage. Emotional integrity removes manipulation without ever naming it. It reveals who is present for connection and who is present for control. Jung spoke often about the danger of living through the persona too long. Eventually, it becomes empty. Being around an empath accelerates this emptiness, because there is nothing to perform against. The empath isn't impressed by charm, guilt, or emotional theatrics. They respond to truth. And when truth is the standard, false affection cannot survive. This is where envy enters the picture. The admirer begins to resent the empath's inner stability. The fact that they don't chase approval, that they don't collapse when affection is withdrawn, that they remain grounded even when misunderstood. This independence feels like arrogance to someone who relies on external validation. But it isn't arrogance, it's self-connection. Jung would say this is the difference between ego attachment and individuation. The empath is anchored inward, while the other person is still seeking confirmation from outside. And when that confirmation is no longer available, love reveals its conditions. What once looked like care now shows its cracks. The relationship shifts not because the empath changed, but because they refuse to abandon themselves to maintain someone else's comfort. False affection cannot coexist with emotional integrity. One requires control, the other requires honesty. And when these two meet, the mask eventually slips. There is a quiet kind of wealth that Carl Jung spoke about, one that has nothing to do with status control or superiority. He called it individuation, the process of becoming deeply connected to your inner world, your values, your intuition, and your emotional truth. Empaths often carry this kind of psychological wealth without trying to prove it. They don't announce it. They don't use it to dominate others. It simply shows in the way they understand emotions, read unspoken energy, and respond with depth rather than reaction. This is precisely what unsettles people who measure their worth through power. In a world where influence is often confused with strength, the empath's presence challenges that belief. Their strength doesn't come from authority, intimidation, or control. It comes from self-awareness. And that kind of strength cannot be borrowed, copied, or stolen. Jung believed that true inner richness develops when a person stops living for the approval of others and begins listening inward. Empaths tend to do this naturally. They trust their intuition. They recognize emotional patterns. They sense when something is off, even if nothing is said out loud. And they don't need to overpower anyone to feel secure. For someone who equates value with dominance, this is deeply threatening, because power can be negotiated, taken, or displayed. Inner richness cannot. You can't pressure someone into giving up self-knowledge. You can't manipulate emotional clarity. You can't compete with someone who isn't playing the same game. This creates a strange imbalance in relationships. The empath may appear gentle, calm, even quiet, but emotionally, they are grounded. They don't react impulsively. They don't lose themselves to win approval. They don't collapse under pressure. and this exposes the fragility of those who rely on control to feel important. Jung warned that when people build their identity around power rather than self-integration, they become dependent on external validation. Being near an empath highlights this dependency. The person begins to feel smaller, not because the empath is superior, but because their own sense of worth is conditional. Envy grows in this space. Not loud envy, but a subtle resentment. The empath isn't impressed by titles, charm, or emotional manipulation. They value depth over dominance. And that sends an unspoken message of power without inner substance is empty. For someone invested in hierarchy, this feels like a threat to their entire worldview. They may try to provoke reactions, test boundaries, or assert superiority, but the empath doesn't respond the way they expect. Emotional intelligence disarms power struggles. Calm unsettles aggression. Clarity neutralizes manipulation. And when these tactics fail, frustration turns into envy. Jung believed that what we envy in others often points to undeveloped parts of ourselves. The empath's psychological wealth highlights the other person's inner poverty, not in a cruel way, but in a revealing one. It shows what happens when emotional growth is neglected in favor of control. The empath's strength is internal, self-sustaining, and not dependent on anyone's approval. That makes it untouchable. And what cannot be taken often becomes resented. The person who seeks power may attempt to belittle the empath's sensitivity, dismiss their intuition, or frame their depth as weakness. But these are defense mechanisms, not truths. They are attempts to regain a sense of superiority when dominance no longer works. Jung would describe this as the ego reacting to a threat it cannot confront directly, because confronting it would require inner work, humility, and change, and many people would rather feel envy than evolve. The empath, meanwhile, often doesn't realize the impact they're having. They aren't trying to challenge anyone. They're simply living from the inside out. But that alone is enough to disturb those who live from the outside in. Psychological wealth without the desire for power reveals a different kind of strength, one that stands quietly, cannot be manipulated, and doesn't need permission to exist. Carl Jung believed that one of the mind's most powerful defense mechanisms is projection. When a person cannot tolerate something within themselves, feelings of inadequacy, failure, weakness, or unfulfilled potential, they unconsciously place those feelings onto someone else. This allows the ego to stay protected while avoiding self-examination. In relationships with empaths, this process becomes especially intense. Empaths tend to be emotionally aware, reflective, and inwardly honest. They are not perfect, but they are willing to look at themselves without running away. And this willingness alone becomes threatening to someone who has spent years avoiding their own inner truth. What begins as admiration or affection slowly shifts into comparison. The person may feel drawn to the empath at first, even dependent on them emotionally, because the empath represents safety and understanding. But over time, that same presence becomes a mirror. The empath's calm, emotional clarity, and self-connection silently highlight the other person's unresolved inner conflicts. Instead of facing those conflicts, the psyche redirects the discomfort outward. Jung explained that projection is not intentional, it is automatic. The person does not wake up and decide to resent the empath. They simply begin to feel uneasy around them. They may accuse the empath of being distant, judgmental, or emotionally superior, qualities that often reflect how they feel about themselves. The empath becomes the container for feelings the other cannot bear to hold. This is why what looks like love can feel confusing and heavy at the same time. On the surface, there may be care, closeness, and shared history, but underneath there is an unspoken comparison happening. The person measures themselves against the empath and comes up short. And rather than asking, "What part of me feels lacking?" they ask, "What's wrong with you?" This is the tragedy of projection. It turns self-reflection into blame. The empath becomes a silent reminder of roads not taken, emotional maturity not developed, authenticity not lived, inner work postponed or abandoned. Jung believed that the traits we criticize most harshly in others often point to qualities we either repress or fail to embody. So when someone belittles an empath's sensitivity, they may be rejecting their own vulnerability. When they mock emotional depth, they may be hiding their own emotional emptiness. When they accuse the empath of thinking they're better, they may be struggling with feelings of inferiority. None of this is conscious, yet it shapes behavior in subtle, damaging ways. Passive-aggressive comments appear. Support becomes inconsistent. Affection feels conditional. The person may oscillate between closeness and distance, warmth and coldness. The empath senses the shift but often internalizes it, wondering what they did wrong. In reality, they did nothing. They simply existed in a way that triggered unresolved self-comparison. Jung warned that projection continues until the individual is willing to reclaim what they've disowned. But many people would rather distort reality than confront their inner wounds. so the empath becomes the emotional scapegoat. Instead of dealing with shame, regret, or self-doubt, the envious person displaces those feelings onto the empath. This creates a painful dynamic because the empath often responds with understanding rather than defense, which only deepens the imbalance. Their compassion unintentionally reinforces the projection, allowing the other person to avoid responsibility even longer. Over time, resentment grows. The empath's presence feels like pressure, even though no demands are being made. It's not the empath who is judging, it's the other person judging themselves through comparison. Jung would say this is the ego protecting itself from collapse. Admitting inferiority feels too dangerous, so the mind rewrites the story. The empath becomes the problem. But beneath that story lies grief for a self that was never fully developed. Envy, in this sense, is not about wanting what the empath has, it is about mourning what one failed to become. And that grief, when left unacknowledged, turns into quiet hostility toward the one who unknowingly reflects it. Carl Jung believed that real psychological growth is not gentle or comfortable. He described it as a kind of inner death, the death of the ego's old identity, illusions, and defenses. This process is necessary for transformation, but it is also deeply frightening. Empaths, often without intention, activate this process in others simply by being present. They don't demand change. They don't give lectures. They don't force insight. Yet their way of being, emotionally aware, grounded, and honest, creates an environment where inner contradictions rise to the surface. For someone who is not ready to evolve, this feels like a threat. The empath's presence gently dissolves emotional avoidance. Conversations feel deeper. Silence feels louder. Unresolved feelings begin to stir. And when the psyche senses that old coping mechanisms are no longer working, it panics. Jung would say this is the ego defending itself against dissolution. The ego wants stability, familiarity, and control, even if that stability is built on suppression and denial. Empaths destabilize this structure by embodying a different way of living, one where emotions are allowed, self-reflection is normal, and authenticity is valued over image. This contrast is not neutral. It quietly asks a question the other person may not want to answer. Are you living truthfully? For those unwilling to face that question, discomfort quickly turns into resistance. Envy becomes a psychological shield. Instead of admitting fear of change, the mind reframes the empath as the problem. Their calm feels unsettling. Their insight feels intrusive. Their emotional depth feels excessive. None of these reactions are about the empath. They are about the transformation being triggered. Jung emphasized that people often cling to their suffering because it is familiar. Letting go of an old identity, even a painful one, feels like annihilation. Being around an empath threatens that identity. It exposes outdated beliefs, unhealthy patterns, and emotional blind spots. This exposure can lead to growth, but only if the person is willing to endure the discomfort of ego death. Many are not. So instead of transforming, they defend. They minimize the empath's influence. They question their motives. They withdraw warmth or replace curiosity with criticism. Envy emerges because the empath appears to have already crossed a threshold the other fears approaching. The empath seems emotionally integrated, less reactive, more at peace. This is not because life has been easier for them, but because they have faced themselves. Jung would say they have already died a few psychological deaths. To someone still clinging to old defenses, this looks like superiority, when in reality it is surrender. Transformation requires humility, vulnerability, and courage. Envy allows the ego to avoid all three. It shifts attention away from the inner call to change and toward resentment. The empath becomes a symbol of what transformation demands, and symbols can feel overwhelming. This is why relationships with empaths often go through sudden shifts. Someone may feel drawn to them, inspired even, and then abruptly distant or hostile. The psyche approaches the edge of growth, senses the risk, and retreats. The empath feels the loss, but often doesn't understand it. They didn't do anything wrong. They simply stood in their truth long enough for another person to glimpse their own falsehoods. Jung believed that when transformation is resisted, the psyche finds ways to numb awareness. Envy serves that purpose. It reduces admiration into irritation. It turns inspiration into threat. It protects the ego from having to change. But this protection comes at a cost. The person remains stuck while resenting those who move forward. The empath, meanwhile, continues on their path, often alone, often misunderstood, yet inwardly aligned. Their presence will always stir something in others because transformation cannot be unseen once it is felt. Whether that stirring leads to growth or envy depends not on the empath, but on the willingness of the other to let the old self die and allow something truer to emerge.